Dr. Manuel Pastor is the director of USC's Equity Research Institute. He is also the author of State Resistance, What California's Dizzying Descent and Remarkable Resurgence Means for America's Future and Equity Growth and Community. And equity growth and community, what the nation can learn from America's metro areas. Welcome to the show, Doctor.
Glad to be with you.
So I guess the first question I have to ask you, being in California, having written about climate change and equity, is Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, doing enough right now in the face of all these fires?
Boy, that's a pretty tough question to get started with.
Let's throw him out early.
I know, exactly. Just bing. There's a level of excitement and a level of disappointment. The level of excitement comes from, for example, the governor just a week or two ago setting a new standard for 2035 that all new vehicles sold in the state of California need to be zero emission, and that trucks will have to meet that standard probably about a decade later. But what was best about this pronouncement was that inside of it, there were also restrictions or proposed development of restrictions on oil drilling near communities. That's something that very much plagues communities of color. And there was a lot of language in there with regard to just transition and the provision of jobs to people who have long been frozen out of labor markets. On the other hand, the governor hasn't moved as far forward on fracking as a lot of people would want. There was environmental justice legislation about toxics that he failed to sign. So it's a mixed record, but it's also a record in a very difficult political environment because the pressure from business right now not to do anything anti-business and the leverage they're trying to make from this COVID recession to get what they want, it's pretty severe.
I mean, for those who may not be aware, which I don't know what rock you're living under, California has a supermajority. And so oftentimes activists get frustrated because, Democrats control California. This isn't Reagan's California anymore. There should be prime opportunities. It's, I would say, probably the most progressive state, able to affect major changes. So this power business has over the legislature and leadership. What are the industries that seem to be, holding leaders from really taking a seismic moves to combat climate change?
So, thank you for mentioning the book, State of Resistance. I'll mention it again because I think people forget about California. They were the state that gave you Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, tax cuts, anti-immigration hysteria, racist policing and over-incarceration, and an attack on affirmative action. And 25, 30 years later, very, very different state. And a lot of that has to do with social movement organizing and how it changed the political calculus on the ground. Now, the thing I think to realize at the same time is that while we've got a 2/3 supermajority, we've got a number of business or moderate Democrats that are part of that 2/3 supermajority. It's not all progressive. And indeed, one of the things that business has realized over about the last decade is that betting on a dying Republican Party is not really the way to go. No Republican in this state holds statewide office. And the places that they're hanging on are places that they're increasingly losing power. And you will know from the last midterm elections that basically almost all Republicans left in the state of California got wiped out. Dear God, great news. But it also means that business is trying to figure out how to play with moderate Democrats because that's the game, because they can no longer bet on Republicans because the Republicans can't hold anything back. And that means that there's a real challenge. 2/3 supermajority doesn't mean 2/3 supermajority for progressive ideas. And the way that we're going to get there is through the kind of grassroots organizing that changes the political dynamics on the ground and means that the elected officials have to be responsible to grassroots power.
while we're on that subject, you have this jungle primary now, and jungle primary means the top two vote goal. It's like ranked choice voting, but not quite. You probably understand this more than I do on the ground, but as a result, you have races now where like Shahid Buttar is up against Nancy Pelosi, and I'm sure many others have been able to reach power. But has that weakened the Republican Party, or did that start before?
What's very interesting, this was currently in the state, the most popular in terms of registration party is the Democratic Party. Second is decline to state. And third is the Republican Party. So it is what we hope will happen to the national Republican Party, that it's so marginalized itself through aligning with business, aligning against climate change, and aligning with xenophobic and racist elements in the state, that it became a permanent minority. And there's a little bit of that certainly we saw in the 2018 congressional, the midterms, and I think we're seeing in 2020 as well, with Republicans hanging on to Trump, even as Trump is representing the sort of dying elements of the Republican Party. Now, in that atmosphere, it has created opportunities for those kind of runs when we've got this so-called jungle system, so that progressive Democrats can run against mainstream Democrats and actually not worry about the Republicans actually limping their way into the, general. But it's also a problem because one of the things that happened in Gavin Newsom's last run when he became governor was in the primaries, he spent all of his money against the Republican candidate and tied them to Donald Trump. Why did he do that? To knock out Antonio Viracosa, who would have been his somewhat moderate, actually Democratic, but Latino, aligned with progressive social movements competition. But by spending all of his primary money against the right-wing Republican and making people aware that he was running, he lifted that guy, John Cox, up. And it was John Cox who wound up in the general, which meant the following thing. In the general, Gavin Newsom had only one debate. And that one debate was with John Cox on KQED public radio at 10:30 in the morning on a Monday. So essentially Newsom was able to get in without clearly laying out what he was going to do. So there's elements of the jungle primary which are good, which is that progressive Democrats can make their way in. But a smart politician like Gavin Newsom was able to game the system and avoid any serious discussion of what he was going to do. And even as he, was able to avoid that discussion, he's wound up facing the biggest climate catastrophes, the biggest public health catastrophes, some of the biggest catastrophes or discussions around what we need to do about racism without having queued up earlier what he was going to say or do about those things.
So interesting. You briefly mentioned Antonio Villaraigosa, who was the mayor of Los Angeles, Latino, and the politics of the Latino population, growing huge population in California, probably also affected the Republican, who was in power and how the Republicans lost power. But it's also extremely progressive, especially when you look at younger Latinos who, DACA, whatever, people who, we know how powerful it was in the Bernie election in terms of Bernie was able to mobilize a tremendous number of young Latinos, and they, of course, influenced their family, and we saw that all across the Southwest. But you wrote recently about the Latino vote and the Biden campaign and how they're not doing enough. Biden-Harris campaign is not doing enough to excite the Latino vote, and excite means appealing to the younger voters. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, so let me complicate the story a little bit because I think it's important for your audience to understand. The activation of Latinos in California occurred in the wake of Prop 187,
right,
in which there was a virulent anti-immigrant attack. It was supposedly at undocumented immigrants, but it was really aimed at all immigrants, and in particular Latinos. And that activated the Latino vote so that 4, 5, 6 years later, immigrant Latinos who were naturalized were voting at a higher rate than white voters. So one of the things that shows you is that there will be, in the wake of attacks against immigrants, an activated Latino vote. But it wasn't only that. The labor movement was actively cultivating Latinos as workers and as voters. There was a broad social movement effort in the state of California, in black communities and Asian communities, because there was a recognition that the state was becoming a new majority state. By 1998, folks of color were the majority in the state of California. So why is that important? Because I think what the Biden campaign has been doing is assuming that because Trump is such a xenophobe, that the Latino vote will just kind of necessarily come their way. And they didn't put in the work, for example, that Chuck Rocha advised about the Bernie campaign to put in during the primaries. The Bernie campaign was able to activate younger voters, labor voters, progressive voters within the Latino community. And I think that was incredibly important. You do need to realize it didn't work as well in Texas. It didn't work as well in Texas because that's a more moderate Latino vote. But I think what the Biden campaign has gotten wrong is that they thought that there's no other venue for Latinos. They thought that advertising, not just in Spanish, but with different accents. And I think you know that what they're doing is they're cutting ads in South Florida that are in a Cuban accent. They're cutting ads for Central Florida because there's a big Puerto Rican population there that's in a Boricua accent. And they're cutting ads for Texas in the Southwest that's in a Mexican-American accent. Talk about pandering. What you really need to do is cultivate relationships. Latinos will vote for people who show up and not just at an election, but in the process of getting ready for the election. And that's what the Biden campaign hasn't done. The Biden campaign has put a lot of their resources into the white working class in the blue wall states and into black voters in the South and elsewhere, because those are constituencies that Biden has some experience with, but he had better wise up pretty quickly. Because if you look at Arizona, where you could actually win, and if you look at Texas, where if you ran a vigorous campaign cultivating Latinos, you could at least get the Republicans to waste resources in that state, trying to hold their own. And if you look at the Midwest, which people forget, which has in the citizen voting age population Latinos that are about 3 to 5%, and that could become your cushion in case black voters don't show up, or some of these white working class voters that are currently excited about Biden drift their way back to Trump over time. So this is something that has to be happening nationwide, has to be happening in places where people don't automatically see the Latino voter, and it has to be happening well before Election Day. And man, are we coming way too close?
We're in the middle of it right now. I mean, you look at Arizona, 80% of Arizonans vote before the election because they're used to it in a supposed red state. It's interesting that you say that because if I recall, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Hillary, actually the one population that was not depressed, working population that was making under $50,000 a year, were Latinos, because she invested in Nevada. She had a good outreach director. They put a lot of money into Texas. They obviously didn't win Texas, and they did it, in exchange for putting an office in Wisconsin. But it seems like there's like an overcorrection in this campaign. I might be completely wrong, but I mean, to the extent that Biden actually blamed Bernie for the low Latino turnout low approvals he's getting in Florida with the Puerto Rican population. Obviously, Cuban was always going to be very hard because they're more conservative leaning. It just seems strange to me that this mindset seems almost uniquely Biden or Biden campaign. Like, I felt, am I wrong that the Clinton campaign put more resources into Latino turnout?
No, you're not wrong about that, but I think it's important to recognize the history. like it or not, or like I should say, like Hillary Clinton or not, both she and Bill Clinton actually cultivated a relationship with Latinos, put Latinos into positions of power within the first Clinton administration, and continue to show up at the meetings of National Council of Raza, etc., into intervening years. So when Clinton showed up in 2016, she was not an unknown quantity to people. And in fact, one of the reasons why she did better than Bernie in that constituency in the primaries in 2016 was simply because she had a history. I just really want to get back to this point that if you show up 3 days before election, people are, ¿Y quién es tú? Who are you? Like, where have you been, right? All my life, right? There's a sense of loyalty, a sense of showing up that I think is valuable or valued in every community, but it's particularly valued in the Latino community. Bernie corrected for that. Bernie showed up well before. He also micro-targeted. He knew that he would do quite well with the young, do well in California and Arizona and Nevada, knew that he would do well with working people, and that's where they wound up targeting their resources. I think that Biden's both making a mistake and also he kind of limped his way to victory, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he won, but it wasn't like, he was running out of money, and it really wasn't a great strategy, right? So what they should have done after it was clear that they had won the nomination and Sanders was conceding, etc., was begin to really plant their seeds and their resources into the communities where they hadn't done the outreach. What Biden seems to be counting on is a blue wall strategy rather than a Sunbelt strategy.
That's right.
And the problem with that is that in the long run, the Sunbelt's going to make a difference. And in the long run, or even in the medium or in this election.
Maybe in this election, yeah.
Tying up Republican resources in defending their position in the Sunbelt, that's going to win you voters in the blue wall. Because if you're a Republican party or candidate and you're defending yourself in Texas, that's a dollar you're not spending in Wisconsin.
That's right. And there's the down ballot effect too. I mean, how many folks right now feel, they're running for office, they want to flip a seat, they have the potential to flip a seat, whether it's in a Republican legislature in Arizona or Texas or city council or DA, and there's no energy on the ground. And so you are also possibly losing a generation of great leaders because we're addicted to the presidential cycles. One last question right before we wrap up, and I appreciate this is, I think, a fascinating conversation, and folks seem to be loving it right now. How much of it is also about just the deportation policy of the Obama-Biden administration?
Well, that was certainly a big alienating factor. Obama got labeled deporter-in-chief first by activists and eventually by pretty mainstream Latino leaders. And I think one of the concerns that's going on right now is that the Obama campaign of 2008 made a lot of promises, implicit and explicit, to folks who were deeply concerned around immigrant rights, particularly in the Latino community, and then postponed doing anything around comprehensive immigration reform, and then used a strategy. I mean, I really do believe that what Obama did was to say, well, gosh, if we show how tough we are on immigrants, we're going to bring the Republicans around. If you show how tough you are on immigrants, the Republicans are just going to ask for more meanness, cruelty, and stupidity, because that's apparently what their party has become all about, and Trump is the perfect representation of that. So I think it behooves us to make sure that we in the Latino community actually do mobilize our community to vote, even if Biden's not doing it. But make sure that we don't make the mistake that so many made with Obama, which is that you get really excited that you've elected this progressive leader, at least in your mind progressive, and you don't realize that what we need to do is to provide wind to his sails when he is right and hold him accountable when he is wrong. And he was dead wrong on immigration. And what we need to make sure is that Biden understands that he needs to move on immigration immediately. To stop the deportations, to protect the people who've got temporary protected status, and to protect the DACA youth, and then begin queuing up comprehensive immigration reform. One last word. They also need to realize that Latinos are not one thing, even in places where you think they are. So don't give up on Florida. Yeah. Cubans are actually a distinct minority within the Hispanic population in Florida. There's this huge growth of other folks from Latin America, of Puerto Ricans who fled Hurricane Maria and have landed in Orlando, and you can run a progressive campaign and catch that part of the population, Black Floridians, progressive white Floridians, and craft a coalition that can win you Florida. And again, even if you don't win, have a lot of down ballot sweep that can bring up progressive folks enough to change the state of Florida. And again, tie Republican resources up so you can win elsewhere. So I hope that these lessons are listened to by the Biden campaign. I'm not sure they're listening to either you or I, but I think that we can make sure that these lessons actually get there.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's they've got to build these coalitions, block the Republicans, help the down ballot, because God forbid in a couple of years we're in this situation again. In a few years we're in the situation again where, I mean, I don't know how many times we have to say it. These courts matter. The state legislatures matter. The leadership in these states matter, especially when the presidential races could come down to courts and state legislatures and, frankly, Congress. So I appreciate you. Thank you for joining today. The chat loved you. Dr. Manuel Pastor, he is the director of USC's Equity Research Institute. I love that.
I do too. Ha sido un placer. Gracias.
Thanks for watching and listening to The Nomiki Show. But remember to click like and subscribe on YouTube, and please share on social media. If you're not already a patron, please join us for as low as $5 a month on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show for early and special content. That investment makes a huge difference. We are not corporate media raking in the dough. It's really you guys that are keeping us going. So please consider being a patron. And to our current patrons, thank you so much. We are incredibly grateful to you. We also now have swag. So check us out on thenomikishow.com to get your mugs, your totes, and your stickers.